The air in the old-school auditorium hung thick with the scent of floor wax and faint, sweet perfume. It was a familiar smell, the scent of community gatherings and school assemblies, a place where the seats were a little sticky and the stage curtains were a heavy, faded maroon. The evening's talent show was rolling along, a charming parade of local hopefuls. A group of women had just finished a slightly off-key but enthusiastic folk song, and the polite applause was still dying down as the announcer, a man with a friendly face and a suit that looked a little too warm for the room, walked back to the center of the stage. He tapped the microphone, producing a gentle thud that echoed slightly in the quiet hall. "All right, folks, settle in," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. The kind of voice meant for reading the news or hosting bingo night. "We have a very special treat for you next. We have some incredibly talented people in this town, and sometimes the most incredible talent comes from the smallest among us." He paused, letting the words sink in, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Our next performer is a young man who has a true gift. He's going to play the piano for us." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. People shifted in their seats, the old wooden chairs creaking in unison. In the front row, a woman with tired, kind eyes and hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, sat up a little straighter. This was her moment too. She had been here for every rehearsal, every practice, every moment of frustration, and every small victory. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. From the side of the stage, a small figure emerged. He was just 9 years old, a slight boy in a simple, crisp white shirt and dark trousers. He wore a pair of dark glasses that completely hid his eyes, making his face seem small and serious. A kind-looking woman, a teacher from the school, gently held his shoulder, guiding him with a light, sure touch. He didn't stumble or hesitate. His steps were careful and measured, his small black shoes making soft, scuffing sounds on the wooden floor. He wasn't walking so much as he was listening his way forward, his head tilted slightly, as if catching the echoes of the room to paint a picture in his mind. The audience watched him with a soft, collective tenderness. A few people offered encouraging smiles to his mother in the front row. A man in a flannel shirt leaned over to his wife and whispered, "Oh, that's sweet. A little blind boy." The sentiment was shared by many. They weren't here to see a virtuoso. They were here to support a child, to witness an act of courage. They were prepared for simple mistakes, for a fumbled note, for a performance that was more about the spirit than the skill, and they were ready to love it for that. As the boy reached the center of the stage, the grand piano loomed beside him, a polished black beast of wood and wire. It seemed enormous next to his small frame. The teacher guided him to the bench, her hand never leaving his back until he was securely seated. He ran his small hands along the smooth wood of the bench, feeling its edges, getting his bearings. It was a ritual, a moment of grounding himself in this space. Then his hands lifted and found the keys. For a moment he just rested his fingers on the cool ivory. He didn't press down, he just touched them, his hands spread across an octave. To him, this wasn't just an instrument. It was a landscape. Each key was a stepping stone, a familiar friend. The sharp, jagged feel of the black keys, the smooth, cool expanse of the white ones. He knew this terrain better than anything else in the world. It was the one place where darkness didn't matter, where sight was irrelevant. Here he could see everything. His mother watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the subtle straightening of his spine. He was home. The anxiety that had been her constant companion for the last hour began to fade, replaced by a deep, swelling pride. She remembered when he was just a toddler, his tiny hands reaching out, not for toys, but for the sound of the radio, for the vibrations of a speaker. She remembered the first time they'd found an old, out-of-tune piano at a thrift store, and how he had pressed the keys, not randomly, but with a strange, innate sense of melody. As if he were simply remembering a song he'd always known. The auditorium was now completely silent. The shuffling had stopped. The whispers had died. The only sound was the faint hum of the stage lights and the gentle, almost imperceptible rustle of the program in an elderly woman's lap in the third row. Everyone was waiting. The boy on the bench took a quiet, slow breath, his chest rising and falling. He wasn't thinking about the hundreds of eyes on him. He wasn't thinking about being blind or being 9 years old. He was thinking about the music. He was thinking about the story the notes had to tell. His fingers, which had been resting so gently, began to stir. They shifted slightly, finding their starting position, a familiar and comforting place on the map of the keyboard. And then the first note sounded. It was soft but clear as a single drop of water in a still pond, and it held the entire room captive, waiting for what was to come next. The first note that hung in the air was not loud or showy. It was clear and pure, like a single perfect chime in a quiet temple. It didn't just break the silence. It filled it, shaping it into something beautiful and expectant. For a moment, no one in the auditorium moved. It was as if that single sound had reset the entire atmosphere, wiping away the polite clapping and the shuffling feet and replacing it with a shared, focused stillness. Then a second note followed, and a third, weaving together the gentle opening melody of the waltz, the boy's hands, which had seemed so small and fragile against the vast expanse of the keyboard, now moved with a quiet confidence that was startling. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. His fingers knew exactly where to go. They danced lightly over the ivory keys, pressing down with a touch that was both firm and gentle. It was the touch of someone who was not just playing an instrument, but having a conversation with it. The melody that flowed from the piano was simple at first, a sweet, romantic tune that felt like a gentle breeze on a warm summer evening dot in the third row. The man in the flannel shirt, who had settled back in his seat expecting a charming but clumsy performance, found himself leaning forward. His initial whisper of "that's sweet" had been replaced by a silent, open-mouthed surprise. He glanced at his wife, whose eyes were fixed on the stage, a look of wonder on her face. She gave him a subtle nudge, as if to say, "See? I told you." The gentle melody was not the simple tune of a child learning to play. It was phrased with a sophistication, a delicate understanding of rhythm and space, that was far beyond the boy's 9 years. It was the kind of playing that came from a deep, innate connection to the music. The boy's body began to move with the rhythm. It was a small, almost imperceptible sway, a gentle rocking from his shoulders down to his feet. His head was bowed, his dark glasses hiding his eyes, but it was clear he was completely lost in the world he was creating. He wasn't just reading notes from a page in his memory. He was living the music. Each note seemed to have a color and a texture for him, a story to tell. The blindness that had evoked such sympathy from the audience moments before now seemed like a gift. Without the distraction of sight, all of his energy, all of his senses, were funneled into his hearing and his touch. He was feeling the vibrations of each note through the wooden bench, through the floor, up into his very bones. He was listening not just to the sound, but to the space between the sounds. For his mother in the front row, this was a world she knew well. She saw more than just a boy playing a piano. She saw the thousands of hours of practice that had led to this moment. She remembered the rainy afternoons spent at their old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano, his small hands struggling to stretch for a chord. She remembered the tears of frustration when a passage was too difficult, and the sheer, explosive joy when he finally nailed it. Each note he played now was a victory, a testament to his incredible determination. As the melody flowed, she felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, a knot she had carried all evening, finally began to loosen. Her hands, which had been clenched so tightly in her lap, uncurled. A single, happy tear escaped and traced a warm path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, a small, personal tribute to the miracle unfolding on stage. The music began to grow, like a story finding its voice. The simple, gentle melody started to become more complex. New harmonies were introduced, weaving in and out of the main tune like threads of gold and silver. The pace quickened just a fraction, and the boy's hands responded in kind. His fingers moved with a new energy, a purposeful drive that propelled the music forward. The audience, which had been holding a collective, gentle breath, now found itself leaning in even more. The polite smiles had vanished, replaced by expressions of deep concentration and awe. A group of teenagers in the very back row, who had been slouched in their seats and whispering to each other, fell silent one by one. The girl who had been scrolling through her phone put it down, screen dark, in her lap. The boy next to her stopped fidgeting. They, like everyone else, were being pulled into the current of the music. It was a powerful, invisible force that transcended age and taste. It wasn't just a pleasant tune anymore. It was a narrative full of emotion and meaning. It spoke of longing and of hope, of quiet moments and grand dreams. The young musician on stage seemed to grow with the music. His small frame seemed to fill with a new energy, his posture straightening, his movements becoming more fluid and expressive. He was no longer just a 9-year-old boy. He was a conduit for something much bigger. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was an extension of his heart and soul. The people in the auditorium forgot that he was blind. They forgot that he was a child. They were no longer watching a performance. They were experiencing a moment of pure, unadulterated beauty. The music swelled, filling every corner of the old hall, washing over everyone, and promising that the best, the most powerful part of the story was still yet to come. The gentle breeze was turning into a powerful, sweeping wind, and everyone was holding on, ready to be carried away. The gentle breeze of the opening melody had now gathered into a powerful, sweeping wind. The music was no longer just a sweet tune. It was a living, breathing thing, growing in strength and complexity with every passing bar. The boy on the bench seemed to feel this change too. His slight sway became more pronounced, a deep, rhythmic rocking that seemed to come from the very core of his being. He leaned into the piano, his body curving over the keys as if trying to get closer to the heart of the sound. The dark glasses, once a symbol of his limitation, now seemed to give him a kind of mystical power, shutting out the world so that only the music could get in. The waltz entered its passionate middle section. The notes came faster, richer, and filled with a new kind of energy. It was a sound of grand ballrooms, of swirling dancers and dramatic glances across a crowded room. The boy's left hand, which had been providing a simple, steady rhythm, now began to dance a dance of its own. It moved in powerful, sweeping chords that gave the music a deep, resonant heartbeat. His right hand, in turn, soared with a melody that was full of longing and a touch of beautiful sadness. It was a conversation between the two hands, a story of question and answer, of push and pull, of joy and sorrow, all tangled together. In the audience, the shift was electric. The quiet appreciation had turned into a shared, breathless captivation. People were no longer just watching. They were feeling. The man in the flannel shirt had completely forgotten he was in a dusty old auditorium. He was somewhere else, somewhere the music was taking him. He found himself thinking of his own wife, of the first time he saw her across a crowded college cafeteria. The music was telling that story, their story. He reached over without looking and took her hand. She squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes glistening as she stared at the small figure on stage. A boy who had somehow unlocked a memory she hadn't thought of in years. The teenagers in the back row were a portrait of rapt attention. The girl who had put down her phone now sat with her chin in her hands, her expression one of pure, unfiltered awe. The boy beside her, who had been slouched so low he was almost sliding out of his seat, was now sitting bolt upright. They were sharing an experience, a rare and beautiful moment where the digital world fell away and something real and powerful took its place. They didn't care that the performer was a kid or that he was blind. All they cared about was the raw, honest emotion pouring out of the piano and washing over them in waves. The boy's mother watched it all through a haze of tears. These were not tears of worry or sympathy, but of overwhelming, bursting pride. She saw the way his fingers, which still seemed so small and childlike to her, could command such a powerful sound. She knew the struggle behind every single note. She knew about the hours he spent with his teacher learning to read Braille music, his fingers flying across the raised dots as quickly as sighted people read words on a page. She remembered the day he told her that the black keys felt like mountains and the white keys were valleys, and that a song was just a journey through that landscape. Now, watching him, she could see that journey so clearly. He was climbing the highest mountains and soaring through the deepest valleys. And he was taking everyone in the room with him. The music continued to build, layer upon layer of sound and emotion. The melody became more intricate, weaving in and out of complex harmonies that should have been impossible for someone so young to master. But he wasn't just mastering them, he was owning them. His touch on the keys was a marvel of sensitivity. One moment, his fingers would be flying across the ivories in a dazzling, rapid-fire run of notes that sounded like a cascade of crystal bells. The next, they would slow down, caressing a single, lingering note with such tenderness that it felt like a whisper, a secret shared between the musician and his instrument. The air in the auditorium had changed. It felt thick, heavy with unspoken emotion. The silence between the phrases of the music was as powerful as the music itself. It was in those quiet moments that you could hear the collective, held breath of hundreds of people. The stage lights seemed to shine brighter, glinting off the polished surface of the piano and catching the slight sheen of sweat on the boy's forehead. He was working, truly working, pouring every ounce of his concentration and his soul into this performance. His small body was an engine of pure musical expression, and it was running at full throttle. An elderly woman near the front, her silver hair neatly coiffed, closed her eyes. She didn't need to see the boy to feel the music. It was transporting her back 60 years to a winter night in a grand hall in a city she had left long ago. She could almost feel the scratch of a wool uniform on her partner's arm, could almost smell the perfume and the cold night air as they waltzed under a glittering chandelier. A single tear, just like the mother's, traced a path through her powder, but she was smiling. This boy, this blind 9-year-old, had given her a priceless gift. The feeling of being young again. If only for a few precious minutes, the performance was reaching its peak. The waltz was driving towards its most dramatic, most emotionally charged passage. The tempo quickened, the volume swelled, and the boy's entire body was now in motion. He was no longer just sitting on the bench. He was a part of the music, a vessel for its passion. His shoulders rose and fell with his breathing, his head tilted back slightly. His face turned towards the ceiling as if he were drawing inspiration from the very rafters of the old building. The sound was immense, filling every corner of the space, a tidal wave of beautiful, heart-wrenching sound. The audience was on the edge of a precipice, feeling that something incredible was about to happen. They were holding on, breathless, waiting for the final, soaring crescendo that would release all the tension that had been building throughout this incredible, unforgettable performance. The music was a story, and it was about to reveal its most profound secret. The music was no longer just sound. It was a physical force in the room. It pressed against the walls, vibrated through the floorboards, and settled deep in the chest of every person sitting in the quiet auditorium. The boy on the bench was a storm of motion, his small body channeling a power that seemed far too large for it to contain. His fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion that was almost too fast to follow. They weren't just hitting notes. They were sculpting them, shaping each one with a precise and deliberate touch. The melody soared to its highest, most dramatic peak, a heartbreakingly beautiful cry of sound that was filled with a grand, sweeping passion. It was the sound of joy and sorrow all mixed together, a sound so full of life it felt like it might burst. This was the moment. The entire performance had been building towards this peak, this emotional summit. The audience was right there with him, perched on the edge of their seats, their hearts beating in time with the powerful rhythm of the waltz. The man in the flannel shirt felt his own throat tighten, a strange and unfamiliar ache blooming in his chest. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. The music was pulling memories and feelings out of him that he didn't even know were there. The teenagers in the back were no longer slouching. They were leaning forward, their faces illuminated by the stage lights, their expressions a mixture of shock and wonder. They had never heard anything like this. They had never felt anything like this. And then, as the music reached its most intense, most overwhelming point, something shifted. It wasn't a change in the music. The notes continued to pour from the piano, rich and resonant. The shift was in the focus. It was as if a spotlight, invisible and silent, had suddenly narrowed from the grand, roaring sound to the small, still face of the boy at its center. He was leaning so far into the piano now that his forehead was almost touching the wood. His dark glasses were slightly askew, and the stage lights caught the edge of his cheek, which was damp with sweat, and then it happened. The wait for IT moment that no one knew they were waiting for Dot from beneath the dark glasses. A single perfect tear escaped. It wasn't a dramatic sob or a flood of emotion. It was just one clear drop of liquid shimmering under the bright lights. It clung to his eyelash for a moment, a tiny perfect sphere, before it let go and began a slow, silent journey down his cheek. It traced a clean, glistening path through the faint sheen of sweat, moving with a heartbreaking slowness. The boy didn't wipe it away. He didn't even seem to know it was there. He was completely, utterly lost in the music, his entire being focused on the torrent of sound he was creating. His fingers continued their intricate dance on the keys, his body continued to sway with the rhythm. But the tear was there, a stark, visible testament to the profound, soul-deep emotion he was channeling. It was a secret he had just shared with the entire room. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air out of the auditorium. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a wave of realization that washed over everyone at once. The man in the flannel shirt saw it, and his hand, which was still holding his wife, squeezed it so tightly she flinched. He felt a prickle behind his own eyes. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was personal. This was real. The tear was a message, a raw, unguarded glimpse into a world of feeling that was so deep, so pure. It was almost too much to witness for the mother in the front row. The sight of that tear was both a dagger and a balm. She knew exactly what it was about. She knew the story behind the song. She knew that this wasn't just a waltz. It was a conversation. It was a farewell. It was a promise. Her own tears, which had been flowing quietly, now came in a rush. She wasn't crying because her son was sad. She was crying because he was brave enough to share his sadness, to turn it into something so beautiful that it could break 100 hearts all at once. She saw the tear, and she saw her own love for him, her own fears for him, and her own immense, overwhelming pride, all reflected in that tiny, glistening drop. The teenagers in the back saw it too. The girl with the phone brought a hand up to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. The boy beside her just stared, his usual teenage mask of cool indifference completely gone, replaced by a look of raw empathy. In that single tear they saw a story. They didn't know the details, but they felt the weight of it. They felt the love, the loss, the memory. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity, and it connected them all in a way that words never could. The music swelled around them, but now it sounded different. Every note was imbued with the meaning of that tear. The soaring melody was no longer just beautiful. It was a cry of longing. The powerful chords were no longer just dramatic. They were the weight of memory. The audience was no longer just listening to a performance by a blind 9-year-old. They were witnessing a soul laid bare. They were hearing a love story, a tribute, a goodbye. The silence in the room was now so profound, so thick with unspoken emotion, that it felt like a presence all on its own. The only things that existed were the boy, the piano, and the heartbreaking, beautiful story they were telling together. The tear continued its slow journey down his cheek, a silent, perfect note in the grand, roaring symphony of his performance. The world outside the auditorium had ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this raw, powerful, unforgettable moment, hanging in the air like a star about to fall. The final, resonant chords of the waltz hung in the air like a soft, glowing mist. They didn't just end. They faded, slowly and gently, leaving behind a profound and echoing silence. The last vibration seemed to hum through the wooden floorboards, up the legs of the seats, and into the very bones of everyone in the room. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. It was a silence so complete it felt sacred. The man in the flannel shirt found he was holding his wife's hand so hard his knuckles ached, but he couldn't let go. The teenagers in the back were frozen, their faces still turned towards the stage, their expressions unchanged from the moment the tear had fallen. The elderly woman had her eyes closed, a faint, peaceful smile on her lips, as if she were still waltzing in a memory from a lifetime ago. The silence was broken by a single, sharp clap. It came from a man in the middle of the room, an impulse he couldn't contain. It was a loud, solitary sound that cracked the stillness. Then another person joined in, and another. Within moments, the quiet shattered. A wave of sound erupted, not the polite, measured applause of a talent show, but a thunderous, emotional roar. People were on their feet, one by one, then in a rush, until the entire auditorium was a standing, cheering, weeping sea of humanity. The applause was deafening, a physical force that seemed to push back against the lingering silence of the music. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated awe, a release of all the emotion the boy had poured into the room. And as the ovation swelled, the story behind the performance began to unfold in the minds of the audience, a narrative as clear as if it were being whispered in their ears. They understood now. This wasn't just a song. It was a tribute. The boy was playing this piece for his grandfather, his first and most beloved music teacher, the man who had passed away just a few months ago. His grandfather was the one who had first put his hands on a piano keyboard, who had taught him that the black keys were mountains and the white keys were valleys. His grandfather was the one who had told him, over and over again, "Don't worry about what you can't see, my boy. Music is a landscape you can see with your heart." The second waltz was their song. It was the melody his grandfather would hum while he made breakfast, the tune they would listen to together on old, crackling records, the rhythm his grandfather would tap out on the boy's small hand to teach him about time and feeling. The boy wasn't just playing notes from a page. He was playing a memory. He was playing the sound of his grandfather's laughter, the feeling of his rough, gentle hands guiding his own on the keys, the warmth of the hug they would share after a long day of practice. Every soaring note was a shared moment of joy. Every poignant chord was a memory of comfort. The performance had been a conversation across the divide between life and death, a final, beautiful goodbye. The tear that had rolled down his cheek suddenly made perfect, heartbreaking sense. It wasn't just the emotion of the music. It was the memory of his grandfather. It was the love he still felt, so strong and so real that it had to find a way out to escape his body and join the music in the air. He had channeled all of his love, all of his grief, and all of his beautiful memories into those few minutes on the stage. He had invited a room full of strangers into his most private world to witness his love and his loss. And they had accepted the invitation, and they were changed by it on the stage. The small boy seemed to slowly come back to himself. The intense focus on his face softened, and his shoulders, which had been held so taut, relaxed. He seemed to shrink a little, the immense energy that had possessed him now receding, leaving him looking like what he was, a tired 9-year-old boy. He could hear the roaring applause, but it seemed distant, as if he were hearing it from underwater. He was still floating in the landscape of the music and the memories. The teacher who had guided him to the stage now walked back to his side. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, and he turned his head towards her. A silent question in his posture, she leaned down and spoke softly in his ear, though he couldn't have heard her over the noise. He just understood. He slid off the piano bench and stood, a little unsteady on his feet. He turned to face the audience, a sea of blurry shapes and overwhelming sound. He brought his hands together in front of him, his fingers still trembling slightly from the effort of the performance, and gave a small, shy bow. It wasn't a performer's bow, practiced and polished. It was a simple, humble gesture of thanks. As he straightened up, a faint, sad smile touched his lips. It was the smile of someone who had just shared something incredibly precious, and was now feeling the sweet ache of the memory. His mother was making her way to the side of the stage, her face a mess of tears and a smile so bright it could have lit up the whole room. She didn't care about the applause or the standing ovation. All she could see was her son, her brave, incredible son, who had taken his deepest sadness and turned it into a thing of such beauty that it had touched the hearts of hundreds. He had done what his grandfather had always said he could do. He had made them all see with their hearts. The audience continued to cheer. many of them wiping their own eyes, clapping until their hands were sore. They had come to a small-town talent show expecting an evening of simple entertainment. Instead, they had received a gift. They had witnessed a miracle of the human spirit. They had seen a blind boy not just play a piano, but paint a masterpiece with sound, a portrait of love that would stay with them long after the final notes had faded away. The boy stood there on the stage, a small figure in a storm of sound and light, a testament to the idea that even in the deepest darkness, the most beautiful music can be found if you only have the heart to listen.